One way, which is like you can do it,
Yeah.
but the infrastructure to do it is so insane that I don't think it is viable. Versus the other way is the infrastructure doesn't exist, but if you connect the dots together, people can actually consume it.
We just got to do it. We just got to do it once and show people it's possible.
Well, welcome to Gigabytes. Hopefully today's episode is under 32 gigs versus last episode. But today I want to really focus in our conversation around virtual reality because it's now right back into the limelight in conversation. But I want to discuss it in a little bit of a different lens. I think overall, whenever people are hearing about VR, talking about all these cool new applications for both MetaQuest 3 as well as Vision Pro, open OS system versus closed OS system, all that's cool, but a lot of the conversation's still around the visual aspects of what virtual reality can be and how are we portraying a virtual sense of a real world and then reproducing it in a virtual world. Obviously the companies that are building this are thinking about everything from audio to visual and everything across that, but a lot of times when people say virtual reality, you're still only thinking about what I'm gonna see around me to like feel like it's real. Versus combining all the senses together, which once again, the organizations are looking at how to combine the senses to make that ultimate depiction, but usually just in natural conversation with people think of VR as in, I see this new world, I'm in this new world.
Well, because that's all that's been able to be synthesized at the moment.
So I want to focus on everything but that.
How to bring the other senses to an actual virtual reality. I mean, let's think about it. The name of virtual reality is the part that's already throwing people off because it's supposed to be a synthesized version of reality. It could be any type of reality. It could be fantasy reality. It could be a real space. It could be a fictional space or whatever. But the name of it is kind of confusing because we assume VR is only visual because that's all what's been worked on at the moment. But yeah, name sucks. It should just say this is a visual virtual reality and for the moment. And
I think the question I have is like you're depicting you're creating this dimensional space visually, but then when I'm hearing the audio, for example, it might still be stereo or it might still be very like
or binaural
right
now,
but like overly simplified context of the environment that you're in. Is that true or false?
And definitely we are definitely jumping more and more into the space, learning more about it as we've kind of gotten a command over our fundamentals here. And the stuff that we have seen so far and the holdup we see coming from the audio side, right? Which is a lot of experiences seem to want to have a single user, like an agent, in the middle of the scene with a, what's called like a VR 180 view around you, and then basically like an XY or a binaural microphone that is supposed to represent your ears looking in that space. The idea is that as you turn around the space, you should be able to see different aspects and focus on different aspects. A lot of times that XY stays the same, and even if you look at one direction, it'll just kind of pan more to one versus the other, and that kind of simulates moving your head on like a lateral plane. True binaural or ambisonics then shoots directions from captures from all different directions, which then means that you have a vertical version of that XY as well, so that you can have kind of this full range, just like you have in visual. But right now that's kind of the limitation, which is there's a camera and there's a bunch of microphones pointing in different directions that help to, as you move around, you can see and hear from that direction as you're going around. What if there's other agents in the area? What if there's other elements that are in the area? What if the object is coming from that side and coming towards you? And does the single point of capture the fullest extent of the environment or the scene or the volume? I don't know. From what we've seen, it seems limited still. But yeah. So, and I think you obviously went into a very technical lens of like what are like current potential limitations around it. I think what's interesting to me is like the word spatial, right, means something different to almost everybody. Oh my God.
And the reason why I want to lean on that before I start talking about like where kind of audio is moving versus the rate of visual is, first, it's important to kind of define the concept of spatiality or objects that are in a space. And for example, right now we're in a room and there's a bunch of objects that are stationary around us.
Right.
But sometimes there's objects that are dynamic, like a human that might be walking around or moving, which is going to change the entire soundscape around me.
Yes. Yeah.
Right now, at least, the capabilities, my understanding is, if I am stationary myself, the person perceiving that experience, I can have those objects spatially move binaurally within like a headset or something to portray that pretty accurately. But not if I was to take a real-time screenshot of this environment as it's moving, or like a capture of
Like
this
a snapshot. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's more of a snapshot versus kind of a dynamic nature of the environment changing around you. What's your kind of thoughts on that take?
I think I see what you're getting at here, which is if there are objects in the scene that are dynamically moving, they're dynamic, obviously.
Yeah.
Is a streaming view of available channels to the sensors that are picking up what's happening in that space, is that sufficient to be able to represent interacting with that object? Right. So let's take that same example. Let's say there's a third person here with us. There's you, there's me. We're stationary, and there's a dynamic third person walking in this view. If I was in a VR headset and the VR headset was showing me a wide angle capture where I could still look around in the VR headset because it's capturing this whole area, right? And I can look between left and right. And there's a microphone system that's capturing between left and right as well, or just this whole area. Then yes, if I'm observing from the same perspective of that capture system that we have, then yes, this object moving back and forth will be accurately represented from that perspective, because this system is capturing the perspective of this location from this object moving back and forth, where I'm located, where you're located. Now, what if you change that location? What if me in the VR space notices something odd about that object and wants to go investigate it at a different angle? Well, unless my capture system is capturing all of those potential angles, then there is nothing for me to jump to in the VR space. And the only way that we've seen something like that is from a video game if it's completely synthesized from scratch. The only way you can have control over how this object's sound and visuals, and also how the light reflects from it and whatever, it can only be happened if the physics were programmed in it from the beginning.
Got it.
How do you capture the physics of a real life person moving forward? I can't capture your temperatures, the emissions coming from your mouth, the shoes that are squeaking on the floor and how they're interacting with it. There's so many elements about a real life thing that is dynamically moving that is so hard to capture every nuance of it, so that way you can then reproduce that from any direction inside a virtual space.
Well, that's a lot, but in a good way of what you're kind of presenting, which is exactly the point I want to get to. The systems of how we currently create sound, and we did talk about this a little bit in a channel-based mechanism.
You mean the capture
yeah, the capture side of it. Then to the reproduction side of it, it's a I don't want to say oversimplified version, but it doesn't capture the nuances of that environment and the dynamic nature of that environment to then be reproduced for somebody to perceive it as they perceive the real world. And that's kind of the gap that currently exists in audio that needs to be bridged. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly the way. And I think you could extend it not just for audio, but for all the other senses as well, including video, right? If you have a stationary camera observing a wide angle, that's one thing, but what if you're changing the perspective of where you're viewing the angle from, right? If I want to then move around this side and see the other wide angle of it, I can't walk through my VR space because the capture system is not dynamic or changing. Now you could do something where as your display, your VR display, as you move, it can detect where you're moving and then have some sort of camera on like a tripod or something that zooms into a new spot. That could be kind of cool, but that's also incredibly invasive. So it's almost like we have to figure out a way, if we want a truly interactive way to explore a dynamic environment with dynamic actors in that environment, we have to figure out a way to get the real world to emulate a video game as much as possible and get all that fidelity and detail and put it in the video game engine and capture those physics and put them into the video game engine and have this kind of like translation cloning that happens in order to be able to have that same type of video game like exploration experience.
So let's lean on examples so listeners can kind of follow along maybe with like some things that have been on the headlines and how that may portray in visual orientation but not in the auditory, and then we can kind of talk about how you can fill in the gaps. So
what's on the headlines?
Well, so like for example, something that we've seen is in Rocket Field Mortgage Fieldhouse. Okay. So they have Canon cameras. They worked with ESPN around the Final Four, Women's Final Four, around the capture. And they were able to real time create I don't think it was real time, but post production wise, they were able to create a volumetric rendering of the game, where exactly what you're talking about. You can go to the different perspectives, and you can be on the court, and you can actually see the players move.
And you can walk around the whole space, right?
Yeah,
that's cool.
So that's a very dynamic way that you can do that visually. But if we then talk about, okay, there's a mechanism to do that visual side. Then let's talk about the auditory side.
Right.
So now for audio, the way that it's currently captured and the way that they were able to then marry those two experiences together was still from that static viewpoint. Even if you're moving around the court and you're getting closer to a player, closer to the ball, or closer to somebody with sneaker squeaks, the audio was still static based off
non-dynamic.
Right? It was based off the same mix you would have on the broadcast, versus the visual. There's already a technical layer of how you can actually create and bridge that visual gap.
Right.
But for audio, there isn't. So is there a core reason why right now we just can't get there?
Right. Yeah. And that totally makes sense. I'm guessing that the visual, without having seen the visualization you had in there was, what's it called? Like maybe it wasn't exactly photorealistic, but it was object skeleton realistic.
No, it was pretty
photorealistic. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Cool. The audio side of that, it makes sense that it's not emulating those objects. Those objects are the visual objects are created because there are cameras located in multiple different perspectives, capturing every nuance and aspect of what's happening in this field. It's almost the same as having a bunch of 3D cameras throughout the field, but obviously you can't have 3D cameras on the court, so you have to have the cameras basically emulating, getting all those capture perspectives off the court. So I think Hawkeye does that as well, has other cameras on there, and then Canon's probably got a bunch more cameras in that field to do something that high of a resolution. We would have to do something very similar with audio in order to capture all the different sides. When a character moves one side, player when a player moves one direction or another, you have to be able to get that change of rotation and direction with it at the same time. Right now, as far as I understand, with most of the places that we've been with and working with, and remember, we've Edge Thunder Research is really focused on the reproduction side, and as we go up the chain, we're asking, hey, can you isolate certain things or objects, like how things are happening in volumetric side? And it turns out the answer is there's not a workflow in place to do something like that, because we're getting streaming microphone signals. The microphone is capturing really just one perspective, which is this perspective facing this way, maybe kind of a wide angle of it, but still just facing this way, just like we talked about with the camera. And it's sending a mono feed to a board, which a bunch of mono feeds come in, and then we basically mix them together down to a stereo or a 5.1 mix, right? And I think that's kind of it for now, as long as things remain channel based. You can have as many channels as you want, but you're gonna have to either be opening and closing the channels every second. I think we talked about this last time.
A little bit, yeah.
Or they're all gonna have to be summed together in a bus, and then it's basically just how much of the level is in there. And that's been the case for audio for decades, I think, at this point, or almost. Yeah, several decades. That's been the audio workflow, and until we can break out of that channel-based workflow to the point where we can capture multiple perspectives of the same thing, and we can mix objects instead of channels, then I think we're always going to be kind of locked in the state where it's going to be whatever the mixing board can synthesize down to, which right now the mixing board is designed to create a channel, or 2 or 3 or 5, depending if you're doing 501, etc.
So let's go into the defining then, like an object for audio, because I think it's pretty easy for someone to wrap their head around that for visual. Like volumetric video is it's very intriguing to people, because you can see on a screen on wherever they gets posted.
You can point to it.
And you can point to it, and you can see the object be moving around. You're like, I know what the object is. I know what that's moving around.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is something that is not something you can see. So I think it's important for us to define, just so viewers can kind of follow along of where like infrastructure is going, of, okay, that's captured and there's an object there. But if we're talking about that through sound, right, why is it important to define it per the object layer versus defining I'm capturing a scene? Because for example, which you brought up before, video game engines and like how they're built out. I think that nuance between those two is very important to understand first before kind of going deeper into what does that mean for actually workflows and creation of experiences and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Let's see. We might have to back up a little bit and catch up a couple of other definitions. First off is maybe object-based audio and how that's reproduced.
Sure.
So then we can go back to getting a workflow from a place where you can't necessarily do that as easily. So essentially, the difference between a surround system, like a 5.1 or a 7.1 or 9.1, and a object-based system, which could be the same physical speakers in your room, is that instead of trying to put specific signals through each of the speakers, you're trying to use the speakers as almost like projectors to project holographic virtual speakers in the space. So let's say I had the same 5.1 sound. I could have something coming out the left speaker, right speaker, center speaker, rear left, rear right, and the sub. And I could mix and program specific things to come out of those and take all my microphones in the world and have them come through a speaker at a time or something like that, right? Or mix them together and make that type of field. Now, obviously, for a long time, stereo has done a lot and you can do a lot with stereo. But that's the approach for making channel-based surround stuff. But take those same 5 speakers, right? Avoiding the height speakers for the moment, but just take the same 5 speakers and with object audio, you could try to use those 5 speakers to try to project a object like a hologram. Think of like a hologram, right? Project a hologram right in the space, not at the speaker, not in front of the speaker, not in the middle of the speaker, but at a place in this 3D environment of your room where you have the 5 speakers set up, and that's an audio object. So how do you capture the audio object in the real world and try to make that over there? So in post-production in movies, what they do is that they say, great, there is going to be a, let's say like a ball or a bullet or a jet or something flying by from my left to my right here, right? So it's going to then say, great, this sound file, which could just be and just coming through the mono speakers, but now you want that to move from left to right. So you have to program the starting point in the 3D space and then the end point in that 3D space, and it comes across. Now, whether or not you have a stereo soundbar, 3.1 soundbar, a 5.1 soundbar, 5.1 system installed in your room, 7.1 Dolby Atmos, whatever you have, then it will try its best to use the speakers available to project that start point and project that end point. So it will always stay in that same space relative to the room size. That's the cool part about object-oriented audio. But as you notice, that's a lot of pre-programming you have to do to program object 1 moving, and then also object 2, people running forward, many people running back, a car on the side. It's a lot of programming that you have to do to bake all these things in. Now try doing that in a live environment where you have to say, great, person number 1's right here, person number 2, 3, 4, 5, player, what's it called? First 5 players on one team is on one side, first 5 players on the other team on the other side, and we got to program exactly where they always are at every moment, and in order for them to be projected into your room at home. That's a crazy workflow. So that's the hard part. This is the problem. And I understand why a lot of live stuff doesn't have objects to use the object-oriented workflow.
Got it. So if we backtrack visual versus audio for virtual reality, visual mechanisms already exist. They're very costly, but they exist. And there are workflows to do them. Whether they're optimal or not, I don't know. I don't know well enough on the visual side for me to even comment on that. But I know that it's possible, right? I've seen it. I've experienced it. I understand it's possible. I think visual deals with another problem, which is the volume of data. Because the amount of data you need to render visually an environment is insane.
Right.
Because it's just every single thing needs a pixel.
Exactly. Yeah. And you don't want to have it be blurry or something like that. Yeah. You want to get the most detailed data. These cameras got to be at least 4K, if not probably 6 or 8K. And you're doing hundreds of these cameras.
And then from there, so I think the infrastructure problem there for people are big believers in that VR experience and watching sports in VR or whatever in VR is the amount of data you need to pull that off is going to cause a consumer problem, because how does a consumer then enjoy that content if it needs that much content to be streamed?
Right.
It's not very feasible, at least in the short change, until new infrastructure and hardware exists that allows that to be pulled off.
Unless you reduce it down to the objects.
I was going to say, or then you have a new workflow that you look at what is important to create that nuance and complexity of that experience. Somebody wants to be like dynamically involved, but you kind of I would assume you're going to have to make some sacrifices there if you did go that route.
I would say the way we know that the infrastructure already exists is multiplayer games.
Yes.
First-person shooter or whatever, right? You have a multiplayer game. There are multiple live actors that are being controlled, but instead of sending the actual full data of whatever you're seeing on the screen, you can have a very immersive experience by just sending sprite information or metadata of what's happening to those characters and having all the heavy-duty stuff happen locally. So I think if the multiplayer video games exist, we can make multi-actor streaming interactive content as well.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah.
But then it comes down to the audio side. And I think the audio side is actually a lot less around infrastructure needs, at least in my opinion, on like, I mean, still a good amount of data. We're not talking about like a small amount of data. It's still a decent amount of data, but it's a lot less than visual. So I think that's a lot less of a barrier of entry. And it can be reproduced potentially through multiple mechanisms in a space. I think the problem actually in audio is a lot less around consumer end infrastructure. It's more about creator end infrastructure.
That's right, yeah.
To be able to then capture, process, render, reproduce that entire stream that then somebody can actually enjoy those holograms of sound moving freely in their space and kind of be able to consume content.
Yeah, there's just not an infrastructure in place at the capture side of it that emulates something that's happening on the visual side of it. Now, what are the solutions here? Maybe one of them could be something that emulates a visual side of it. Maybe something that's completely separate. Either everyone has to be mic'd up or you have to somehow grab information so that way you could say this one perspective or this one person is being tracked at the whole time. And until there's professional audio has an infrastructure to start looking at that, I don't see that that's going to have a solution anytime soon, except for something that Edge Sound Research might be working on.
Shameless plug. I mean, we'll link our real-time virtual sound engine. Yes. Obviously, we're still very early on in this process, but we started looking through on this infrastructure layer, and I think the part that you brought up, which is very interesting, is thinking of the real world in the concept of a video game engine. And I think that nuance is one, awesome as somebody who loves video games, but also it is a natural step if you're trying to virtualize something. If you're trying to make a real in a virtual space feel, sound, look the same, there's no better way to do it than where video game engines, why the origin of them being created and what they're now able to do. Like, it's insane what you can do in Unreal Engine at this point.
And think about all the the best, any video game that you have. There's so much to explore, so much you could do. You have your free agency. You can interact with it. I mean, some of the best stories have been in video game format because it's not just it's telling you a linear story, but you get to interact with it from multiple sides and perspectives. You get to push the limits. You get to see the boundaries being pushed. You get to figure out exactly what you can and can't do, and then enjoy the story that way you want to. You know, the way you want to. It's a choose your own experience type of format. You know, and that's what reality is. Reality is, hey, if I want to see what happens if I punch you in the face, I do it and figure out the boundaries. Not going to. I think that ends very badly for me. But the point is that's a choose your own adventure. Real world reality is choose your own adventure. So there's no reason why we shouldn't limit people for choosing their own adventure in the virtual space too, even if they can't be at that reality space at that moment. That's the whole point of trying to capture reality and trying to reproduce it so that way somebody can explore that space as well.
So I think that part is very interesting. We're seeing the trend in sports, and we talked about this a little bit before too. It's like consumers want to be able to personally consume the content the way they want to consume it. Whether it's like, I want to stand courtside, I want to stand in the middle of the game. Do they want to consume it in the essence that you're always freely walking around the court? I don't know.
We don't advise you to stand on the middle of the court if there's a game going on.
Yeah, but I also don't know if that's a good experience, right? Like, because those are more fascinating technical aspects than
I feel like it's something that everybody would want to try at least once.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're still spectating. I do think that there will be a lot of power to like consuming like a basketball game, how video game camera angles work, where you can have a follow angle on the top. I do think that like going in, and I got this feedback a lot when I've been talking with those people, which is a fair point. It's like if you do have a perspective of the player, you're probably gonna get nauseous because the player's gonna be moving and you're like, I am not experiencing any of that. So that is wild to me.
But for like investigation or for research or after the game ends, it's like, what happened there? Like, how did he miss that block or something? And you can actually go and freeze the reality and go under and look at it and be, oh, that's how I missed the block. His foot wasn't even on the thing. I can change my perspective and look at a different element of the same play again and again and again. There's so much power to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right now like one of the top use cases, by the way.
Yeah.
Like top use case I've seen in kind of the virtual space for sports is after the fact, so not in real time, but after the fact, being used for player recruitment, player training, player health, all those things. Because you can look at it 1,000 different ways. Oh, you didn't see that person wide open? Let's look in your perspective. Why didn't you see that person wide open?
Or maybe like, why were you looking at that direction instead of looking forward? Right now with the visual, you have the question, what were you looking at, or what was happening over there? Add the sound to it, and all of a sudden you hear someone say, "Loser!" Hey, hold on a second, and then that's how they missed the ball. There's a reason. There's more information to glean from the environment that was happening, because so much happens in the auditory sense as well.
So now that we kind of broken down the infrastructure of virtual reality and where that's going, and when we talk about virtual reality, like it can still also be obviously augmented reality and mixed reality. Like there's other layers that you can portray. It doesn't need to just be full virtual. Virtual is just kind of the end state, in my opinion, of where things are trying to go to emulate real versus virtual.
Really? Fully virtual?
Fully embodied actually is probably better.
There you go.
But the question I have for you is, what do you think, your best guess, we'll get to first? Being able to make visually something indistinguishable or make it auditorily indistinguishable for somebody when they're
I think that's easy. Right now, there's been so much money that's been put into researching. Let's call it cloning, because that's kind of what it is. You're taking a real scene or real environment or real thing, right? You're taking perspectives from all angles, photography or whatever, and then you're trying to emulate that or rebuild it back in a virtual space where you can then do the same thing and interact with it the same way. I think the model cloning or what's called virtual twinning of stuff is already there virtually. There's a lot of stuff that, if I had some AR glasses and I saw a banana on the table, it would look so realistic and have the light be cascading off of it with the ray tracing that you would have no way to know that that's not a real banana on the table. Also, why would you care unless you touch it? I just think not no one, but very few people have been approaching audio in the same way, because as a communication stimulus, there's kind of this sense of it's fine enough because I'm getting depth information visually, and then the audio is giving me information about the scene in the same way that what's it called, like a exposition shot gives you information about the scene of a movie or something like that. It's such a high level thing of it, but there's so much more detail and nuance of, like, if the banana hits the table, you shouldn't have to question, oh, I saw the banana hit the table, oh, but I heard it coming from my left ear. There's a inconsistency or incongruency between those two events. The banana hits the table, the sound should come from that table. You should know, and ideally you should hear it and feel it come from the table, because if something hits the table, there's going to be a little bit of a vibration that happens with all this. So ideally, all senses are captured of an environment in a scene and cloned in the virtual twin, or the digital twin, however you call it. So that way it's incongruent, or there's no incongruencies with that event happening in real life. But then we're starting to talk about Matrix kind of stuff. But it's interesting, like the pieces are there, and if we can figure out how to just tie them together, then I think we're getting closer than we expected to be at this stage.
I think some people expect us to be further along, but at the same time, I think the sentiment changed quite a bit because we also didn't move as fast as people thought we were at the beginning. Yeah. But now we are definitely, like, the technology and everything else, computing, everything's complementary to each other. And I think we're now, especially with artificial intelligence, how you can generatively create things, like we are getting closer and closer to that ultimate point. I wanted to rephrase the question a little bit. What do you think are we able to do in real time? Not just photorealistic, but what can we do in real time? Because I think that's the secondary question, because if it ain't real time, it eliminates a lot of different experiences somebody could have.
Boy, that's a much tougher question. I see why you phrased it. Off the cuff. Theoretically, I think we could get to real-time audio faster if we have different ways of getting positional data. Because since position still requires the computer vision, at least one way of doing it requires computer vision, it just happens to be a little slower than the real-time stuff that we're no one was anticipating that we'd have a real-time solution. And so the fact that we have our real-time audio engine, I think, oh my gosh, it shook people up and saying, okay, we're closer than ever about having something that can happen in real time. And now we just need to find a faster way of getting location data. And we will be ready on, I mean, our part's already ready for running stuff in real time. It's just getting us the position data fast enough. So
it's more of a external infrastructure to be able to pull off the audio side.
Yeah.
Which honestly, I would obviously very biased. We're Edge Sound Research. I'm obviously going to double down on audio being the way you get here first. But the reason why is kind of what I brought up before. It's one is a data problem. Yeah. So like the amount of data you need to do the visual side to do that real time, plus the object tracking, plus everything else.
In the fidelity too. I think
the fidelity and all those kinds of things. That's what I was saying, as like literally indistinguishable and almost as realistic as possible. The visual side, I think we actually don't have the technology today, infrastructure wise, to then reproduce that at the quality you would want, unless you're in a crazy controlled environment with the craziest computing possible.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Which you maybe, but it's not going to be really.
You could have like a super powered edge server that's the training's done separately, and you just need to be able to get the input data and extract the bits of skeletal immediately fast. And you could get some NPUs that are designed for that. You could.
You probably could, but it's going to be like one of a state of the art like system.
Versus
right now, what I think for audio, it's more about the complementary technologies to bridge the infrastructure, and then the users already have a way to consume it. That's what I kind of what I mean is like there's one way which is like you can do it, but the infrastructure to do it is so insane that I don't think is viable. Versus the other way is the infrastructure doesn't exist, but if you connect the dots together, people can actually consume it.
We just got to do it. We just got to do it once and show people it's possible, and then hopefully other people can come in and start streamlining individual processes of this thing.
Yeah,
but it's like I think you're right. Today, a state-of-the-art capture and processing system could theoretically keep up the visual. Still probably be a little bit delayed, but at least could keep up enough that maybe the delay would be within a second or so. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably a today thing. And then a next generation system would probably be able to do a live extraction of the information that's needed to be able to generate the 3D avatars.
Yep.
And then our system, at that point, if they can generate that part that fast, then getting us our simple information, the body location tracking information and rotation, that should be even faster, which means we should be getting that within a few milliseconds, and then our real-time stuff happens within a couple milliseconds as well. So we should be our side would be indistinguishable from reality, and in 2 years the visuals will match it, I hope.
That's kind of scary if we're saying 2 years from now, but yeah.
But like one system will be there to do it. It will be possible at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's kind of cool.
Yeah. No, I think it's overall exciting because I was one of the first people that like tried Oculus back then. I tried PlayStation VR. I tried all these things, and like they're always so interesting and compelling. Even when we tried Vision Pro, it's very very compelling in the beginning. But then you start looking at how do they create more and more experiences for that.
Right.
And that's the part that always leaves me kind of like, Because there's a really interesting a graph that A16Z posted, Andreessen Horowitz, which was the graph of adoption of iPhones versus the adoption of MetaQuest headsets.
Okay.
And the MetaQuest matches the speed of iPhone adoption. And it was a really interesting contrast to show that like the velocity of consumption, we are on the track to make headsets equivalent to an iPhone.
Interesting.
I think the differential there is like there's not enough application yet, in my opinion, for VR versus what there was at iPhone at the same stage with the same amount of volume of adoption.
The killer apps, right?
Yeah. The things that. Why do I have a flip phone at this point? Like I can do it. It's a computer. I can do everything I want. But we're at this interesting moment in time where we're kind of hitting that influx of like we're now going to the early majority of the mass market, and once you start hitting that, it's now 100% a creator dilemma, which I would say Mark Zuckerberg did a great job by making their OS open source at this point.
Yeah.
Because I think that's going to move people in the right direction where there's going to be more competition around different types of headsets, different price points, even more adoption, more creators want to jump on board. But the debate, and I want to hear this is the last segment, I want to kind of hear your thoughts as somebody who is a Apple fanboy from day one till infinity, is do you think it's smarter to do that as an open system, or do you think it's better to do a closed system, which Apple has historically always done, and arguably has won the iPhone race? But when it comes to computers, that's where the debate is, that computers were won by open systems, but phones were won by closed systems. So.
Just to clarify, I was actually an Apple hater when I first came out the womb. My dad's an accountant, so all of this stuff does not run on Mac, at least back in the early days. So I was a very much a diehard PC person back in the day. House full of PCs.
Hard to believe at this point.
It was only once I started realizing how much easier it was to create reliably on the Mac music and videos and so on and so forth, is when I started realizing the power of having the software and hardware talk to each other as far as integration. You can have much lower powered hardware, do things that were outperforming things that had open source hardware with open source software, trying to communicate to each other when all this can be optimized. So obviously that's a benefit. I do think it's in the long term, that's a short term benefit, because if you try to vertically integrate everything, then you close off how you allow people to come in, and you start stagnating on your own ideas, which I think the Vision Pro might be an example of that, at least in the current state that it is. It's not saying that if they don't open it, or opening up to the rest of the developer APIs that Apple has, and there's a lot of things that can be done. So we're looking forward to WWDC, depending on when this comes out. Maybe we'll have an answer by then. But yeah, having the open source layer to this to open up other people to build upon it means that it's more of like a PC style, like a Windows, right? Windows ran on all hardware, and that was the whole point of it. You get people that have maybe competing levels of hardware as Apple's, but maybe at a lower price point, using the open sourceness of this. And then that means that you have the visual fidelity and the audio fidelity that could be at a higher point, that could then handle some of this live streaming things that we have. This really nice AR system where the game is happening on the table, and you can then be able to investigate it, and has all the processing on board, so that way you're just grabbing the sprite information like a multiplayer game, and then it's generating all the things on top of it because it's powerful enough to do that. Maybe the generative AI stuff is going to have a place in this, I'm not sure. It's interesting though, because in today's day and age, I think we would expect the adoption curve to be higher. Because like what's called the OpenAI, the GPT platform was like a 10x of how the iPhone did it, right? Or something like that. It was like a way steeper curve of adoption. Granted, it's software, but
yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, that's a different way to look at it, because now you're looking at the adoption, and it's still, if you look at overall in the market, we're very early in AI, even though like it's a hot topic and it's buzz. Like if you ask who uses it on a day-to-day basis, the answer is still gonna be very low. Like who's tried it is different, who's activated an account different. But who's actually actively using it, you'd be surprised. Actually, it's not as big of a number as you think it is, but it will be massive.
Do you think that when people first bought the iPhone, they use it for all the advanced stuff it can do now today, or they just use it as a phone, like a replacement?
I had an iTouch, and the first thing I got was like the app that you can have as a lighter, and then like the app that was like you can drink a beer, like the dumbest things in the world. But like those were great, right? And then you got like Flappy Bird, you got like great things back in the day. Right?
Like eventually stuff came out.
It started progressing, but I do think that's why Andreessen Horowitz was their graph was relating it to the iPhone adoption. Is like once you hit a certain density of the hardware, right, you're gonna have more developers jump on board, more apps being created, more excitement, which then will propel it into the next generation of experiences.
Yeah, to make it a mainstay of
correct. And that's the overall swap, where the old infrastructure gets left about, and then the new infrastructure comes in. And that's, for me, it's a very interesting case right now, where we're repeating, which has been talked about by multiple tech reviewers, and I like this kind of ideology. Is like there's been 3 generations. Even Mark Zuckerberg said this. Is like you got PC era, you got smartphone era, now you got headset era.
For as far as interfacing with the computation,
it's open or closed systems as the contextual point of each of those, and which one wins that race, and which one actually creates the most value into the market.
Are you talking about between those hardware epochs? You had an open-closed system fight out, and then open closed system fight out.
And usually the person that creates an open system does it due to the fact that they don't make their value off of they make the value off the adoption of the overall ecosystem, and you do it as arguably as a defensive mechanism. When you're in the offensive, or if you're in the lead, you don't need to do that.
Or is it maybe something where the more personal a device is, the more private and sandboxed you want it to be?
I think people given up on data privacy a long time ago, even though it's a hot topic.
If we're going in meta, then yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm saying is right, like Meta makes their money off data at the end of the day, right? Argue it however you want. Every single system they got is to get as much data, which allows them to make really good AI models, which allows them to progress and all that. Which then goes in advertisement. Unfortunate, that's where the data goes. But on the other side of the coin, right? Apple wins on hardware.
I think not just hardware, but also sandboxing, right? For example, if I had my PC with me everywhere I went all the time, 24/7, the open sourceness of it leaves it more susceptible to outside attacks, and if I can put whatever I wanted to it, a bad actor could make something that gets put on it that has not been supervised or whatever. If it's on a computer, it's one thing. My computer got busted, it's got malware. Unplug it, undo it, throw it away. The phone, if my phone gets malware on it, oh shoot, that's all my contacts and everything else that's personal on there. I'm having conversations with my loved ones or people or business contacts or something like that. If I get malware on there and it's sending everybody a thing, that's very embarrassing. Not just a computer thing that's processing, but now it's communicating with people that I know. Now let's go even more personal, put that on the face. I don't know. Maybe it's like, hey, I see you've been watching this the whole time, or I see you've been playing this game a lot, or I see you like this perspective a lot. It's like, whoa, hold on a second there. These are things that are, personal to to each person, and maybe you don't want that being shared or aggregated or something like that.
I don't think most people are going to think about that in the beginning. I do think eventually over time people are going to realize that, and I do think that's a fair point. I just don't think that adoption rates, the risk factor that you're referring to comes later. The part that people care about, what is the enjoyable thing, and can I afford it?
So you mean like what's going to be the thing that's going to get it to the inflection point of mass adoption?
Once it hits that point, then everybody starts caring about data. I mean, that's literally how the good old World Wide Web works. Everybody thinks it's great until you find out that everything you do is not private.
Do you think that what's it called? Do you think that it's going to be a prevention method, or they're not going to care and they're going to say that the value that you get outweighs the risk, and that'll be the first thing that leads to adoption? Do you think people will be prevented of saying, hey, this is the most personal device I could ever have, and I don't want all that?
I don't think people are going to recognize it that way. That's what I'm saying. I think over time, once you're talking about what we talked about here, right, making virtual and real feel, that's scary if someone can hack that.
Right. That's what I'm thinking of, right?
But we're thinking of the end result. Most people are not thinking that way. Most think when they put on the headset, they're thinking of, wow, this is a great entertainment thing that I'm enjoying for a little bit of time. Not the nuances of, I can give you subliminal messages and make you do something. Right?
Yes.
Because it's a whole different layer than it was with a phone, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole different layer than it was with a computer. So, yeah.
I think that's exactly the part that I'm nervous about, is when something's that personal and it's yielding, or it's addressing all of your senses at once. 'Cause I'm thinking in the future, headsets are then going to have some sort of like haptic projection, or some sort of like ultrasonic haptic projection, or something that's going to be able to touch you, feel you, have a bunch of sensors on it to be able to then represent you to somebody else. So that way, as you're getting closer or whatever, you'll be able to see temperature sensors, etc. There's going to be some crazy stuff, some sensors on your device that's then going to be transmitted to somebody else's device. It's going to be a very personal experience. And yeah, having something that sensory available and having that be open source gives me a little bit of pause. But I think you're right. Until we get to that point, I think no one's going to really care about it.
I really don't think it matters, because at the end of the day, I think it's a big win for the industry. Argue good or bad, that there's multiple organizations that can now make headsets that can all at different price points, that people can choose from, whether I'm buying a $100 headset or I'm buying a $1,000 headset, versus only having two choices in the market. That's good for the consumer at the end of the day. Ironically, the consumer at the end of the day always gets screwed over by the things they don't really understand. But I do think in the near term, open source is going to win. In the long game, I don't know. I think the only way that Apple wins the long game is they have to have something that is so robustly different and better than what you can ever do in this open source system.
Or hypersensual. Yeah, that's the right word. Hypersensual. Sounds like the wrong word, but that's correct. Yeah. As many immersive sensory experiences, a huge multimodal sensory experience, to be this that's the word, hypersensual experience. Am I saying that wrong?
No, I think it's the right word. It just
that sounds weird.
Sounds terrible in context, but
hyper multimodal sensory sensory experience, hypersensory. There we go.
That sounds a little bit better. Even though it's probably not even a word. But awesome. No, I think overall it's a very interesting time. We're progressing so quickly I mean, obviously with our research around sound, it's awesome because we're geeking out about things that we didn't even think were possible. Versus on the other side of the coin, things are moving very quickly on the visual side, and now with infrastructure that's coming into the market for consumers to adopt it, I think it's finally getting to the point of what was touted like 5 to 7 years ago of like, oh, there's just going to be this crazy new metaverse and virtual reality.
There.
Yeah. So
how to hack in the brain to make you believe that you're somewhere by using the sensory organs as the APIs.
Yes. We'll end with that very dark note. But I think this was a good conversation on virtual reality. I hope it scared some people. I hope it also inspired some people. Go back to the dungeon and let's go research some more.
To be clear for everybody, right? We're thinking of this in a safe way, and we're cognizant of these things. So I hope that gives people a little bit of. There's some good red hats in the thing.
Well, yeah, people that should be morally sound should be the ones building this. That's my simple take.
Trying as much as possible. Yes.
Awesome. Well, appreciate the conversation, sir.
Likewise.
I hope that was less than 32 gigs.
I don't think so.